Hey guys, Jared here, and today we're going to cover the top 10 things that you should do with your QNAP NAS to keep your data secure. These tips are actually pretty generic and would apply to basically any NAS, but in some cases I'll be specific to QNAP, as that's the type of NAS that I have here. Number 1. Data encryption. By default, all data stored on the disks within the NAS are stored in clear text, which basically means that anyone with physical access to the NAS is capable of reading any file stored on the disks. We can encrypt the data at rest on the disks to keep it secure from this sort of attack. That way, if the NAS is stolen by a thief, they won't be able to view all your rare memes. This only protects the data at rest when the NAS is powered off. So for example, if someone has to unplug it while physically stealing it. While powered on, once you've entered your password to decrypt the volume, the data becomes readily available for reading. If you are encrypting your data, make sure that you have up-to-date backups of all your content in the off chance that something goes wrong or you simply forget the password. Number 2. Latest updates. Keeping your NAS up to date with the latest firmware available is just as important as installing updates on your phone or computer. Security vulnerabilities are found fairly regularly in different pieces of software running on the NAS, and should be patched as soon as possible. This process is pretty simple. You just log into the web interface, and if there are any major updates, it will prompt you to install them. Alternatively, you can manually check through the control panel by selecting Firmware Update. This is where you can also configure the NAS to automatically check for updates, but don't worry, it won't automatically install them. It's also worth subscribing to the security notifications by email, so that you're aware when any major issues are identified. I'll leave a link to this page in the video description. All it takes is one vulnerability to be exploited, and someone could gain access to your precious data. Number 3. Reduce attack surface. By default, many different services will be running on the NAS, and many more may be available depending on the number of third-party applications that you've installed onto it. The more services that you run on the NAS, the larger your attack surface becomes, as there's more code actively running, which may contain security vulnerabilities. More running services may also mean that the NAS is listening on more ports, potentially allowing more ways for an attacker to connect in, especially if these ports are open on the internet and not just a local network. Application updates are also handled separately from the main firmware updates mentioned previously, so you'll also need to install these from the Application Center from time to time. It's worth going through your installed applications and evaluating what's still required. If there's something that you no longer use, then consider removing it through the App Center. Number 4. Strong password. By default, the admin password of the QNAP NAS is admin, so you definitely want to change the password to something stronger as soon as possible. With the admin password, you can access the web interface to manage the NAS, browse all file shares, or even SSH into it directly, which will essentially allow you to do anything. In an ideal world, the NAS would come with its own unique password that would be included somewhere like the instruction manual, but this is how they've chosen to go about it. So for now, just make sure that you change the password from admin to something more secure. You can change the password through Control Panel, followed by Users. You can also define a password policy through Control Panel, Security, then Password Policy, which may be useful if you have many different users who access the NAS. Number 5. HTTPS. By default, when you load the admin web interface for the NAS, the page will be requested over HTTP. This may be a problem, as the HTTP protocol transfers data over clear text on the network, meaning that if someone else has access to your network, they can potentially capture the credentials to your NAS when you log in. While this may be an acceptable risk in an internal network like at home, many people have their NAS available for access over the internet, which essentially allows anyone the ability to log in and increases the likelihood of a man-in-the-middle style attack, where your username and password will be captured. For example, if you tried to log into the NAS from a public network like a coffee shop or library. To secure the connection, you can instead use HTTPS. When loading the admin web interface, you have the option of ticking if you want to use a secure login, which will redirect you to a HTTPS page. By default, the NAS will use a self-signed certificate, so you can either accept that or otherwise look at creating your own trusted certificate and setting it on the NAS instead. You can also force the NAS to only use HTTPS through Control Panel under General Settings, while the self-signed certificate can be replaced through the Security menu, then Certificate and Private Key. HTTPS will encrypt communications between your browser and the NAS. Number 6. Firewall. Firewall settings can be adjusted through the Control Panel, Security, then the Security Level tab. By default, all connections to the NAS are allowed in. However, we can change this to optionally deny or allow connections from a specified list of IP addresses. Similarly, network access protection can be enabled in the next tab, which will automatically block an IP address after a defined number of failed access attempts over the set protocol. Enabling these settings will ensure that your NAS is only accessed by trusted IP addresses, or if you can't lock down to a specific list, you can at least ensure that that unauthorized login attempts are blocked. Number 7. Antivirus. By default, the NAS has an antivirus application installed but not enabled, which will search all files stored on it for malicious content. From what I can tell, it appears to rely on ClamAV, which is widely used. The antivirus can be enabled by selecting the antivirus icon on the home screen. Simply select to enable it, and ideally you should also select to have it regularly update. You can then define scans in the following tabs. Number 8. Review privileges. From time to time, it's a good idea to have a look at the level of access that user accounts on your NAS have. It's pretty common that over time, some user accounts may no longer be required, and others may have permissions to shares that they no longer need. By reviewing these settings, you can remove accounts that are no longer needed and tighten up permissions where possible, so that if an account is compromised in the future, it's limited in what data it can access. I personally like giving read-only access where possible. That way, if something like CryptoLocker appears on someone's machine, their account has no write access to encrypt the data on the share. Number 9. Check the logs. Logs store data about events that happen on the NAS. They can be found through the control panel, followed by system logs. By reviewing the logs regularly, you can determine if there's any strange behavior taking place on the NAS that shouldn't. If you have an external syslog server, you can optionally forward the NAS logs there. This is recommended because if the NAS does get compromised, an attacker may be able to simply delete the logs, which contain evidence of the intrusion. However, if they're also forwarded to an external syslog server, that's another thing that they'd have to gain access to in order to cover their tracks. We can also see the users online using NAS resources, and optionally enable logging for connections to the NAS. Number 10. Power off. Your NAS can't be compromised if it's not powered on, without physical access. This one is quite simple. You can go to the control panel, power options, and then in the power schedule tab you can define a schedule to automatically power on and power off the NAS. For instance, if the NAS is used in an office environment between 9 and 5, it may be acceptable to have the NAS automatically power down from say 7 PM and then turn itself back on at 7 AM the next day. Files become pretty difficult to steal if they can't be accessed. So those are my 10 best tips to help you secure your QNAP NAS. By putting these simple steps in place, your data will be significantly more secure than previously. There are definitely more advanced security settings available, but these ones are fairly simple to configure as a starting point. Let me know down in the comments what other things you've implemented to secure your NAS, and leave a like on the video if you found the information useful. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for future tech videos like this one.